Welcome to a truly boring history, a soft-spoken journey through forgotten corners of the past. Tonight, we'll quietly step into another bleak chapter of history, told not with excitement, but with quiet honesty. If you're just settling in for a peaceful listen before sleep, we'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. And if this kind of slow, haunting historical storytelling helps you unwind, don't forget to subscribe for more quietly unsettling tales of how people once misunderstood the very bodies they lived in. They believed your body was filled with fluids. 4 of them. Not blood, bone, and sinew as you might understand today, but 4 invisible, yet deeply important humors. These humors, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, weren't just about your physical health. They shaped your personality, your emotions, even your destiny. This idea, born in the mind of ancient thinkers like Hippocrates and refined, or distorted over centuries, wasn't just medical theory. It was a worldview, one so deeply embedded that it would linger for more than 1,000 years, directing how people lived, suffered, treated illness, and died. The 4 humors were not a metaphor. They were the explanation for everything. Blood was thought to be warm and moist. It made you cheerful, optimistic, even romantic. Too much blood, they said, and you become overly joyful, foolish, maybe even lustful. Yellow bile was hot and dry. It made you ambitious, aggressive, or short-tempered. Black bile was cold and dry, responsible for melancholy, depression, and sorrow. And phlegm, cold and wet, brought calmness or sluggishness, indifference, and apathy. Each person was said to have a unique balance of these humors. Your body's health and your moral character depended on how well those fluids aligned with the seasons, your diet, your personality, and even the planets. A choleric man, dominated by yellow bile, might be bold and forceful, ideal as a soldier or ruler. A melancholic, full of black bile, would be introspective, poetic, tragic. Some humors were favored, others feared, but all were seen as natural forces coursing through your veins, beneath your skin, shaping who you were. Sickness then was imbalance. A headache wasn't just pain. It meant one humor had grown dominant, had begun corrupting your system. You didn't treat the symptom. You treated the excess. You didn't ask where the pain was. You asked which fluid was winning. If you had a fever, perhaps you had too much blood. The solution? Bloodletting. You would be cut with a small knife or pierced with a leech until the balance returned. If you had a cough or cold, maybe phlegm was overflowing. The solution might be hot foods, dry air, or induced vomiting. If you were sad, it was the black bile. If you were lazy, perhaps phlegm again. Nothing was random. Everything had a place in the cycle. Diet was not just nutrition. It was medicine. Apples might increase phlegm. Red wine might elevate blood. Onions were hot and dry. Cucumbers cold and wet. Eating the wrong food at the wrong time of year, with the wrong temperament, could be deadly, not metaphorically. Truly, even dreams were interpreted through humoral theory. Nightmares could mean an excess of black bile. Erotic dreams, too much blood. Anxiety, perhaps yellow bile. Doctors didn't need stethoscopes or thermometers. They read your pulse, your urine, your skin color, your voice. They judge your body as a vessel of temperaments, always in danger of tipping out of harmony. And so the body was treated with caution and violence in equal measure. When the humors fell out of balance too far, the treatments grew harsher. Bleeding, purging, starvation, burning. These were not punishments. These were considered necessary corrections, like draining water from a flooded house. A patient who refused to be bled might be considered prideful. One who died in the process might be said to have had a particularly stubborn constitution. This wasn't fringe medicine. It was the mainstream for centuries, taught in the universities, practiced in royal courts, reinforced by priests and poets alike. Shakespeare's characters were steeped in it. Medieval monks whispered prayers over those they purged. Renaissance scholars still clung to the theory even as they studied anatomy in secret. The consequences of this belief were quiet, steady, and far-reaching. Generations of patients were weakened, not healed. Whole families watched loved ones decline under leech and blade. Women were labeled hysterical, melancholic, or phlegmatic. Men were judged for their bile. Children were force-fed to rebalance invisible forces. Everyone bled. No one questioned. Because to question the humors was to question the order of the universe. In this world, pain was not a warning. It was a measurement, a sign that your internal weather had shifted. A storm of fluids had gathered. And only the physician's hand, sharp, confident, often misguided, could restore the peace. And so the blood flowed, and the bile bubbled, and the history of the human body became not a story of learning, but of believing. If the four humors explained what made a person ill, then it was the heart that explained who a person truly was. The heart, they believed, held the soul. It carried emotions. It processed thought. It drove reason. The brain? Cold, gray, inert, a sponge inside the skull that did little more than cool the blood. That was the belief for much of ancient history. The Egyptians, for instance, brilliant engineers, astronomers, and architects, revered the heart so completely that they removed the brain during mummification and discarded it without ceremony. It was often pulled out to the nose with a hooked tool, broken into bits, and thrown away. Meanwhile, the heart was left intact inside the chest or preserved in sacred jars. The heart would be weighed against a feather in the afterlife to determine moral worth. The brain never entered the conversation. To many early cultures, the brain was an accident of the body, perhaps a filler or a vessel for phlegm, a cool mass floating in the skull, surrounded by bone and mystery. You couldn't feel your brain working. You didn't think you were thinking, but you could feel your heart race in fear. You could feel it pound in love. So naturally, it seemed the heart was the seat of everything that mattered. Greek philosophers debated the issue, of course. They debated everything. Alcmaeon of Croton believed the brain was where sensation originated, while Aristotle, perhaps more famously, disagreed. Aristotle insisted the heart was the true center of intellect and emotion, and that the brain existed solely to cool the blood. He believed intelligence was a product of temperature, and the brain's coldness tempered the heat of the heart, like a built-in refrigeration system. And for centuries, people listened to Aristotle. Physicians looked at the chest, not the skull. Emotional outbursts were linked to heartbeat, not thought. Madness was not a mental illness. It was a condition of imbalance, of bad blood or bile rising. When a person behaved strangely, they weren't thinking differently. Their humors were spoiled. Their heart was corrupted. Their soul was diseased. The skull remained sealed, physically, intellectually, spiritually. It wasn't until the Roman physician Galen began dissecting animals that cracks appeared in the theory. Galen observed that severing certain parts of the animal brain caused loss of movement or sensation. He noticed nerves leading to and from the brain. Slowly, reluctantly, the idea that the brain controlled the body began to gain traction. But Galen still held on to humoral theories, and his findings were fused with older beliefs instead of replacing them. In the medieval period, where logic often bent to theology, the brain regained some attention, but not as an organ of consciousness. Rather, it was divided into imaginary chambers, each supposedly handling memory, imagination, and reason. Diagrams from the time show intricate networks drawn over sketches of the head, like architectural blueprints for something no one had ever seen. And still, dissections were rare, banned in many places, feared in most. Doctors read ancient texts instead of the body. They believed authority more than anatomy. A man's skull could be split in battle, and his speech lost forever, but no one would blame the brain. They would say the soul had been disrupted, the balance of energies disturbed. In some traditions, the brain was considered dangerous to tamper with. It was close to heaven, close to the divine. The idea of touching it, studying it, or removing it was both heretical and horrifying. And so, for generations, the brain remained misunderstood, dismissed as passive, empty, or at best, symbolic. Even when Leonardo da Vinci began dissecting corpses in secret and making astonishingly accurate anatomical drawings, his work was hidden for years. His sketches of the ventricles, of the brain's folds, of the way nerves connected the spine to the skull, none of it entered the mainstream. Art noticed. Medicine did not. In the meantime, treatments for mental conditions stayed far removed from the brain itself. A man who could no longer speak might be bled at the ankle. A woman with hallucinations might have her uterus treated or be forced to fast. A child with seizures might be branded with hot iron to draw out the spirits. None of them were seen as ill in the mind. They were imbalanced, possessed, weak-willed, cursed. The skull was just a container. The brain was just a stuffing. Even into the Enlightenment, when microscopes began to open new worlds and physicians began to chart the nervous system, suspicion of the brain lingered. Understanding was slow, resisted at every turn by those who feared what it would mean to admit the soul might have a seat in meat and electricity. Because to believe the brain held our thoughts, our fears, our memories, our dreams, meant believing we were just physical, just machines of flesh. That was an idea many refused to accept, and so they looked to the stars, to blood, to bile, anywhere but the skull, anywhere but the truth. You feel the dull ache first. It starts behind your molar, a sharp throb that deepens with every heartbeat. You can't eat. You can't sleep. The pain spreads across your jaw like wildfire, and soon, even the act of breathing sends a pulse of agony through your face. Today, you might call it a cavity. You might visit a dentist. But in centuries past, they believed something far more sinister was at work. They believed there was a worm in your tooth. Tiny, coiled, writhing, feeding on the bone from within. Across many cultures, ancient Sumeria, Babylon, China, and well into medieval Europe, the explanation for tooth decay was not sugar, bacteria, or hygiene. It was an invisible parasite, a living creature that burrowed into your teeth and hollowed them out with slow, constant gnawing. And people believed it, deeply, universally. It made sense in a way. When a tooth hurt, it felt alive, like something was moving in there, pulsing, vibrating. Sometimes the pain came and went unpredictably. Sometimes the tooth crumbled from the inside, leaving black holes and foul smells. What else could it be if not something alive? In ancient texts, the tooth worm is described with clarity. A white worm, small, wet, and coiled. Sometimes, healers claim to have seen them. In truth, they might have mistaken exposed nerves or strands of decayed tissue for worms. Or they may have invented the sightings to validate the treatment. And the treatments were brutal. In medieval Europe, one method involved holding a hot poker or burning coal near the aching tooth to draw the worm out. The pain was excruciating. But if the tooth smoked or cracked, some believed it meant the worm had been scorched. Others dripped bitter substances into cavities, vinegar, garlic, turpentine, even arsenic, hoping to poison the parasite inside. In some cultures, they smoked the mouth like a chimney, blowing acrid fumes through a reed to suffocate the worm where it nested. If the pain stopped, they believed the worm had died. If it didn't, well, they assumed the worm had burrowed deeper. In more sophisticated circles, early dentists created tiny metal tools called dental worms, spiral drills that could be twisted into rotten teeth. These instruments looked like the very creatures they were meant to destroy, reinforcing the image of a coiled invader deep inside the jaw. In practice, they may have helped clean out decay, but the patient rarely understood the difference. To them, the worm was real. It wasn't a metaphor. It was the enemy inside. This belief persisted for centuries. Even when scholars began to dissect bodies and study human anatomy more closely, the tooth worm remained a stubborn relic of older thought. It existed in poetry, in medicine, in religious warnings. Some claim the worm was sent by divine punishment, proof of sin. Others believe it came from bad air or from sleeping with an open mouth near stagnant water. The methods of removal didn't get kinder. Teeth were yanked with crude forceps or chiseled free with hammer and spike. In poorer communities, it was done with fingers, knives, or stones. The risk of infection was enormous. There was no anesthesia, no sterilization, just pain followed by silence. And often, if the pain returned later, they would say the worm had come back. You can still find references to the tooth worm in medical manuscripts from the 18th century. Even as microscopes revealed bacteria and germ theory began to take hold, the image of the worm lingered, half scientific, half superstition. It had been part of the human imagination for so long that no amount of evidence could make it vanish entirely, because a worm was something people could understand. A parasite made more sense than a colony of invisible microbes. A worm could be killed. A worm could be blamed. Today we know better. Or we think we do. We brush and rinse and fill the cavities with ceramic. We drill with precision. We numb the nerves. We explain the pain. But even now, when the ache returns in the middle of the night, sharp and deep and terrifying, there's still something ancient in the panic. A fear that something is alive in there. Something gnawing. Something we can't see. Long before anesthesia. Before antiseptics. Before doctors knew how to stop the bleeding or prevent infection. They opened the skull. Not by accident. Not from violence. But by deliberate choice. They cut through skin, scraped down to the bone, and drilled into the living human skull, inch by inch, in full awareness, while the patient was still awake. This ancient practice was called trepanation. It wasn't rare. It wasn't fringe. It was widespread, across continents, across centuries, across civilizations that had never spoken to one another. From the Inca of Peru to Neolithic tribes in France. From Egypt to Polynesia. They all seemed to share one strange belief, that boring a hole into the skull could heal. But heal what? The symptoms were varied. Headaches that wouldn't stop. Convulsions. Sudden outbursts. Madness. Spirits. Melancholy. Visions. A head injury that lingered too long. A personality that changed overnight. And in every case, the solution was the same. Open the skull and let something out. They believed something had entered the head that didn't belong. A pressure, a vapor, a demon, and only by creating an opening could that intruder be expelled. The process itself was slow, brutal, and chillingly methodical. Some used flint blades to scrape away the bone. Others used sharp stones, ground in a circle over hours. Later, metal tools were developed. Early hand drills with crude bits. In many cases, the bone wasn't cracked or smashed. It was removed with care in clean, circular discs. This wasn't destruction. It was a procedure, and some people survived. We know this because we found the skulls, thousands of them, across Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Ancient skeletons with round holes in the cranium, edges smoothed over by new bone growth. Signs of healing, evidence that the patient lived days, months, sometimes years after the operation, which means they weren't corpses when the procedure began. They were alive. It's difficult to imagine what that felt like. The pressure of the blade against your head, the sound of the scraping, the moment the cold air touched your brain, your body restrained, your mind unraveling. Maybe you believed it would work. Maybe you believed it would set you free. Some cultures use trepanation to treat head trauma from battle. Others to release bad spirits, causing mental illness. In medieval Europe, it was sometimes used on the possessed. A priest might bless the tools. A surgeon might cut. Together they hoped the opening would allow evil to escape. But what was actually happening inside the skull? They didn't know about the brain's structure, the folds, the lobes, the fragile networks of blood and nerve. They didn't know what damage they caused with every stroke. They didn't see the pressure of the swelling or the danger of hemorrhage. They acted with belief, not knowledge, faith, not evidence. And yet, in some cases, it worked. If a patient had a subdural hematoma, a collection of blood between skull and brain, the pressure might kill them without intervention. Trepanation, by accident or design, relieved it. The skull let go. The pressure eased. The pain lessened. The patient recovered. And so the myth deepened. The hole healed. But the risk was enormous. One slip and the skull cracked. One mistake, an infection flooded the brain. One whisper of wind in the open cavity. And the patient was dead by morning. And still, they kept drilling. Because what other choice was there? For the desperate, for the mad, for the epileptic, for those who heard voices, for those who suffered endlessly with no cause, no name, no cure. The whole was hope, a cruel hope carved in silence. Even into the Renaissance, trepanation persisted. Barbers and surgeons carried kits of drills and hooks. They used them in battlefields, in town squares, in homes, not always as a cure, sometimes as punishment, sometimes as a last resort, sometimes just because they believed it might help. And today, The skulls remain. In museums, in drawers, on quiet shelves labeled with dates and locations. You can see them. Run your finger over the holes. Perfect circles. Clean lines, some the size of coins. Others like windows. They tell the story of people who suffered, who begged, who believed. People who let someone near them take a tool and press it into their head, not with malice, but with conviction, because they thought the pain inside had to be let out, that healing could come only after the bone was broken, that somewhere beneath the skull, something dark was trapped, and if they could just find it, just release it, the mind might finally be quiet. They didn't eat to nourish the body. They ate to manage the soul. In a world ruled by invisible forces, hot and cold, wet and dry, bile and blood, food was not just survival. It was medicine. It was danger. It was transformation. Every bite could bring you closer to balance or tip your entire being into chaos. Doctors, monks, philosophers, all of them wrote about it. Not about vitamins or calories or nutrition as you understand it today, but about qualities. A pear wasn't simply a fruit. It was cold and moist. Lamb was warm and dry. Milk was cold and moist again. Red wine, hot and dry. Beer, cold and wet. And each of these properties interacted with the body's humors, for better or worse. If you had a fever, you were too hot. So you're given something cold, maybe cucumbers or lettuce, if you were melancholic. Too full of black bile, you needed warming, drying foods. Roasted meats, onions, strong spices. If you coughed too much, perhaps you were overwhelmed by phlegm. Then wine and heat were prescribed, not for taste, not for comfort, but for correction. Meals were more than meals. They were rituals of realignment. In the medieval kitchen, ingredients were sorted not by recipe, but by temperament. Spices were powerful. Cinnamon, clove, ginger. They could burn away excess moisture. Bread was safest when dry. Fruit was dangerous if eaten at the wrong hour. Raw vegetables were considered threatening to the balance of your internal weather. And mixing the wrong ingredients wasn't just culinary confusion. It was medical negligence. Cookbooks read like prescriptions. To cool the liver, take capers and vinegar. To purge melancholy, prepare a soup of sorrel and sage. Recipes were timed with the seasons. The hot summer required cool foods to tame the blood. The cold winter demanded heat to prevent the soul from withdrawing into the bones. Monasteries kept detailed records, not of nutrition, but of behavior. Did a monk seem too cheerful? Too lustful? He might be eating too much red meat. Too lethargic? Too weepy? Perhaps he had too much dairy. The soul state could be read in appetite and addressed through the stomach. Even digestion was moralized. To be regular was holy. To vomit was suspect. To crave the wrong food at the wrong time was seen as spiritual failure. Gluttony wasn't just a sin of the flesh. It was a sign of imbalance within the entire self. The meal, once shared in joy, became a battleground for unseen forces. There were no food pyramids, no vitamins, no guidelines except the ancient rules handed down from Galen and Hippocrates and repeated by every learned man for centuries. These rules governed kings and peasants alike. Rich or poor, your food defined you, shaped your personality. A choleric man would be advised to avoid garlic. A phlegmatic woman might be forbidden bread. And if these rules were broken, there would be consequences. Even the hour mattered. Breakfast was a risk. It was said the stomach had not yet woken. Late-night eating could invite nightmares, internal chaos, or worse, the organs were imagined as workers. Give them tasks at the wrong time, and they would fail. A heavy stew at noon might slow the blood. A fig too early might sour the bile. Water during a full moon could disturb the balance of your entire being. This was not superstition in their minds. It was precision. And yet, these beliefs didn't protect them from disease. They still grew sick, still wasted away. But the logic of the system was airtight. If food didn't heal you, it was your fault. You ate it at the wrong time. You paired it poorly. You misunderstood your temperament. The failure was not in the theory, but in the eater. So diets grew stricter. Fasts were extended. Remedies became extreme. and still the hunger remained. In some cultures, this gave rise to religious fasting, not as discipline, but as purification. Eating less meant purging more. It gave the humorous time to rest, to reset. Some saints were said to survive on bread and water alone. Others denied food entirely, believing hunger brought them closer to divine balance. But the poorest often had no choice. They ate what they could: turnips, stale bread, spoiled meat. There was no balance, no timing, no dry to counter the wet, no warmth to answer the cold. And so their bodies broke down. The doctors blamed their constitutions, their humors, their character, rarely their poverty. And so food remained a quiet tyrant. A warm bowl of broth might calm the heart. A sharp wine might awaken the mind. A cold fig might, they feared, bring about an early death. Every plate was a map, every spoonful a calculation, because they believed what you ate could heal not just the body, but the soul beneath it. Sleep was never simply rest. It was risk, a dangerous surrender, a quiet slide into vulnerability that, in the wrong hands or under the wrong stars, could unravel the balance of your body and rot your very spirit. In the ancient and medieval worlds, sleep was a mystery wrapped in danger. It was not understood as a cycle or a biological need. It was a state of imbalance, a dark hallway the soul walked through nightly, and not everyone returned. Too much sleep, they warned, did not refresh the body. It drowned it. They believed that sleeping too long could let the humors pool. Lying still, unmoving, with blood thickening in your limbs and phlegm collecting in your chest, you could smother yourself from within. You would not feel it, but slowly, the forces that govern your health would slip out of balance, dripping into lethargy, into madness, into death. Doctors warn against oversleeping not just for the body's sake, but for the soul's. Dreams were considered real experiences, capable of influencing health, morality, and behavior. The longer you slept, the longer your spirit wandered through the dream world, vulnerable to demonic influences or divine punishments. Dreams were not dismissed. They were watched with fear. Nightmares were not random. They were signs, symbols of internal corruption, a black bile too thick, a soul burdened by sin. Some believe that if you dreamed too long, you were closer to dead than the living, your body slowing to match the tomb. If you didn't wake in time, you might not wake at all. The warnings came from all sides. Philosophers cautioned against idleness. The idle body allowed vices to breed. Oversleeping was proof of weakness, indulgence, or moral decay. Monks wrote about sloth as a sin, one that made the heart soft and the body bloated. To sleep past dawn, in some circles, was to insult the natural order of the heavens. There were classifications of sleep. 2. Light sleep, safe sleep, dangerous sleep. The position of your body mattered. Sleeping on your back could cause your tongue to fall backward, blocking breath and allowing excess humors to choke the throat. Sleeping after a heavy meal was the worst of all. The food, unprocessed, would sit like stone in the belly, ferment, and send poison vapors up into the brain. Even the time of day held power. A nap in the afternoon might be tolerable, but it had to be short, no longer than the length of a shadow falling across your hand. Any longer, and the body cooled too deeply. The organs slowed. The phlegm thickened. Some said even memory could leak away in long sleep, dripping out of the brain like water from a cracked jar. People were told to wake early, to avoid softness, to stay moving, because in stillness they believed decay began. The muscles relaxed too much. The blood congealed. The heart lost its vigor. And if you dreamed during this dangerous sleep, of fire, of water, of falling, it could mean that death was nearby, watching. There were exceptions. Certain illnesses required long sleep, fainting spells, fevers. But even then, the doctor might force the patient awake to be sure they hadn't slipped too far. Not because they feared coma as a medical state, but because they feared the body's balance tipping over the edge into spiritual ruin. And if someone did not wake, they said it was the sleep's fault, that the dreams had taken them, that the blood had drowned the soul in silence. Even the beds reflected this fear. Poor people slept upright on benches or stools, believing it was healthier. Richer homes used firm, narrow beds, Softness was dangerous. A soft bed could lull the body into too deep a sleep, remove the will to rise. Luxury was a threat, not a comfort. In some places, people were woken during the night just to shift positions. Mothers turned their babies hourly. Soldiers rotated their watchmen, not just to stay alert, but to protect against drowsiness that might lead to disaster. And in religious settings, monks awoke at set intervals for prayers, not just for devotion, but as a safeguard against the corruption of sleep. Because what waited in deep sleep was not peace. It was exposure. Exposure to spirits, to imbalance, to self-indulgence, to death disguised as rest. So they feared the sleeper who did not stir, the sleeper who did not speak, the one who woke confused, pale, sweating with fear. That was not just a bad night, they believed. That was evidence. Something had gone wrong. Some door had opened, and something, silent and slow, had passed through the soul while the body lay helpless in its bed. And so they woke early. They rose before the sky, not because they were rested, but because they were afraid. They believed your body held too much heat, too much moisture, too much pressure. And when that invisible balance shifted, even slightly, the solution was always the same. Open the skin and let the blood escape. Bloodletting wasn't a fringe practice. It was medicine. It was science. It was doctrine. For more than 1,000 years, it remained one of the most trusted treatments for everything from fevers to headaches, melancholy to seizures, indigestion to pneumonia. Illness was imbalance, and bloodletting brought balance. Through pain, through weakness, through the slow draining of life itself. The logic came from the ancient theory of humors. For fluids ruled the body: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Of these, blood was seen as dominant, warm, red, full of energy and motion. When that warmth flared too high, it meant fever. When it pooled too deeply, it caused swelling. When it rushed to the head, it brought madness. The answer was to bleed. Doctors studied bloodletting like an art. Where to cut, how much to remove, what time of day, what season. Each vein was believed to connect with an organ, an emotion, a function. A cut on the arm could ease anger. A cut near the ankle could relieve congestion. The temple, the neck, the wrist, each offered a different promise, a different release. And so they cut with knives, with lancets, with special instruments designed only for opening veins. The process was fast but not clean. The blood poured freely into basins. Sometimes warm water was used to coax it out faster. Sometimes suction. Sometimes the wound was reopened again and again across several days until the doctor believed the balance had been restored. For the poor, leeches were more common, collected from swamps, stored in jars, applied to the skin. They would latch, suck, and swell. Some patients were covered with them, behind the ears, under the arms, between the toes. There were even leeches bred for internal use, slipped into mouths or nostrils to bleed the unseen spaces. None of this was considered brutal. It was believed to be curative, a noble suffering. And if the patient grew pale, fainted, or couldn't walk after procedure, that was a sign it had worked. The blood had been excessive. The disease had been aggressive. Weakness meant that the poison had left. It was even used preventatively. A healthy man might be bled twice a year, once in the spring, once in the fall, to cleanse the body of buildup. A woman might be bled after childbirth to restore her humoral purity. Children were bled for nosebleeds, acne, nightmares. Elders were bled to treat forgetfulness. No one was exempt. No one was untouched. Hospitals kept charts, not of symptoms, but of blood. How much had been taken, what color it was, how it smelled. Bright red? Still too rich. Thick and dark? Full of melancholy. Thin and pale? Perhaps balance was near. Diagnosis came from the bowl, not the body. Even royalty submitted to it. Louis XIV was bled dozens of times during a single illness. George Washington, too, was bled heavily during his final hours. More than 40% of his blood lost in less than a day. He died weak, gasping, and still they believe it had been the right thing to do. Because stopping the bleeding too soon might have been the real mistake. Critics did exist, quiet ones. A few physicians questioned the practice, but they had little evidence. The tradition was stronger than the doubt. The text of Galen, the words of Avicenna, the diagrams copied from medieval manuscripts, they all pointed to the same conclusion. Sickness was inside the blood, and to heal, you had to spill it. So the practice spread across continents, across cultures, across religions. Muslim physicians bled patients with surgical precision. Christian monks included it in their rituals. Jewish healers mapped veins with prayer and calculation. Different methods. Same goal. Open the body. Let the excess out. And what did the patients feel? Sometimes relief. Sometimes nausea. Sometimes nothing at all. There was no anesthesia. No antiseptic. Just cloth, pressure, and faith. And when infection set in or death arrived, they said the disease had been too strong. Never that the blade had been too deep. Never that the cure had become the cause. Even as medical science advanced, bloodletting refused to disappear. Into the 19th century, it remained popular. Doctors in polished clinics, dressed in fine coats, continued the tradition, now with more expensive tools, more refined methods. But the same belief, the blood held secrets, and suffering released them. It took centuries to let go of the blade. Centuries to believe that the body might heal without being emptied. Centuries to stop measuring health by the sound of blood hitting a bowl. But for those who lived in that older world, where the invisible forces ruled and pain was proof of care, the act of bleeding was not just treatment. It was trust. Trust in the wisdom of wounds. Trust that the body could be corrected if enough of it was removed. They didn't laugh. Not in the way we do today. In the past, a loud belch after a meal wasn't impolite. It was expected, a sign that the body had done something important. A fart wasn't shameful. It was noted, sometimes praised, sometimes feared, but never ignored, because every sound the body made was believed to mean something. In a world where illness was caused by imbalance, where blood and bile and phlegm had to flow just right, the release of gas wasn't accidental. It was evidence. It was information. It told the physician what was happening inside the hidden corridors of your organs. Digestion was a sacred and dangerous process. Food entered as substance and had to be transformed into something usable. Anything left over, waste, air, vapor, was a body's signal that something hadn't gone smoothly. And so, when a patient farted in the presence of a healer, they didn't blush. They waited to be interpreted. The air escaping the body was believed to carry the imprint of the humors. A dry fart might be from excess heat. A moist one, too much phlegm. Loud, sharp expulsions were often assigned to yellow bile, suggesting irritability, aggression, or inflammation somewhere deep inside. Burps were treated with the same reverence. They weren't just an after-meal reaction. They were seen as expulsions of corrupted air, gas that rose up from the stomach when food had begun to rot or ferment. A patient might be told to induce a burp, to relieve pressure, or to judge their diet. Sweet-smelling? You were in balance. Sour or sulfurous? Something was festering. Monks recorded these moments in quiet journals. Brother Thomas reports steady burping after soup. Prescribed mint and cold bread. Brother Elric passed wind during night prayers, recommending warm wine and fasts. These weren't jokes. They were treatments. And the treatments themselves were designed to control the air. Spices like fennel, caraway, and anise were added to meals not just for flavor, but to reduce the buildup of wind. Ginger and cumin were prized because they moved the flatulence, encouraging it to rise upward as a burp rather than sink downward and disrupt the bowels. Wind was feared because it was invisible. It moved through the body without trace, without shape. If trapped, it could cause swelling, pain, or madness. A tightness in the chest, trapped wind. A strange cramp in the leg, a cold wind had taken hold. Even psychological symptoms, sudden anger, weeping, or confusion, were sometimes blamed on gas that had entered the wrong chamber of the body and pressed on the soul. Doctors didn't always understand the organs, but they knew when something moved. They called it the rising of the vapors. These vapors could come from food, from spoiled blood, or from a disobedient liver. When the vapors rose too far, they disturb the brain. Headaches, dizziness, delusions. And so they used purgatives and emetics to drive the vapors down. Or they prescribed foods that would ground the wind and keep it from rising. In wealthy homes, meals were carefully planned to reduce the wrong kind of gas. Too many legumes, too much onion, too much cabbage. These were known to stir the air. But not all wind was bad. Some believed that releasing gas regularly was a sign of a clean gut. Women were instructed to air the womb. Men were advised to fart before bed to ensure restful sleep. Etiquette manuals from the Renaissance include advice on how to pass gas gracefully, not silently but appropriately. One text recommends lifting the body, but slightly, so as to ease the humors without offense. Another suggests that burping after a meal was a compliment to the cook, a signal that digestion had begun and the food had met the body well. Even in medical theater, physicians performed experiments to examine how gas moved through the body. They would inflate animal intestines or study the gurgling of the gut, trying to determine where the sound originated and what it meant. There were no x-rays, no scopes, only the ear, the nose, the instinct. If the belly roared, it was noted. Sometimes, if a patient died suddenly and the cause was unclear, physicians blamed stagnant wind. They believed the gas had turned toxic, seeping into the blood, overwhelming the brain. Some deaths were even described as the breath collapsing inward. The fear of trapped wind led to strange inventions. Bellows inserted rectally, tubes made of reed, enemas of warm milk, and honey, not to cleanse, but to release the air. One method included sitting naked on a stone warmed by fire to awaken the bowels. In colder regions, patients were placed near goats or dogs to absorb the creature's body heat and encourage release. The line between digestion and emotion was never clear. Too much gas, and the soul became cloudy. Too little, and the body grew rigid, depressed. A good fart could bring clarity. A deep belch could restore cheer. These were not embarrassments. They were messages from the inside, and if ignored, the consequences could be severe. So they listened to the gurgle, to the hiss, to the silence that lasted too long. Because in the old view of medicine, sound was life, and the absence of sound, that was the warning. It wasn't seen as natural. It wasn't even seen as necessary. Menstruation, in the eyes of ancient physicians and theologians, was a warning. Evidence that the female body was unstable, toxic, and deeply vulnerable to corruption. It was feared, watched, misunderstood, and weaponized. A monthly phenomenon that inspired more confusion than comfort. They believed it was a purge. A monthly evacuation of excess blood, bile, and vapors that, if left inside, would spoil the body. According to Galenic medicine, women were colder and wetter than men. Their bodies were imperfect, unfinished, prone to imbalance. Menstruation, they claimed, was the body's way of venting that weakness, a release valve to prevent hysteria, madness, or death. If the flow stopped, the consequences were dire. Blocked menses were thought to cause swelling in the womb, pressure in the brain, or suffocation of the soul. A woman might faint, scream, hallucinate. She might fall silent and waste away. Entire volumes of medical writing were dedicated to explaining how to restore the flow, with herbs, with bleeding, with fire and prayer. Because without it, they believed, she would die. But when it did arrive, each month, each cycle, it wasn't celebrated. It was feared. They believed menstrual blood was poisonous. Not metaphorically, but literally. It was described as corrosive, acidic, foul. Pliny the Elder warned that a woman's touch during her period could spoil crops, dull blades, and kill bees. If she sat near a mirror, it would rust. If she walked through a vineyard, the grapes would sour. Even her breath was thought to carry disease. And so, she was separated. Not always by force, but by expectation. She was told to stay away from sacred spaces, from medicine, from marriage beds. In many cultures, she was made to sleep alone, made to eat differently, made to speak less, not because of pain or discomfort, but because her body had become, for those days, spiritually and physically dangerous. Religious texts joined the chorus. In Leviticus, a menstruating woman is declared unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touches her is also unclean. In some early Christian writings, menstruation was seen as a consequence of original sin, a monthly reminder of Eve's failure, of the flesh's betrayal. In medieval Europe, it was debated whether menstruating women should be allowed to receive communion, enter churches, or even speak sacred words. And in the medical world, the theories only deepened. Some said that a woman's emotions were governed by the womb, and that menstruation was not just physical, but emotional release. If it was delayed or irregular, she might weep for no reason, laugh too loudly, rage without cause. This wasn't seen as a mental condition. It was the womb's rebellion, the blood trying to escape. The treatments were often cruel. To restore balance, women were bled elsewhere from the ankle, from the arm, to mimic menstruation. They were forced to drink iron, vinegar, or boiled herbs to stimulate the womb. In more severe cases, hot stones were placed on the lower abdomen. Sometimes live leeches were applied to the thighs. The goal was to stir the blood, to trick it into flowing, because if it didn't, it meant something worse was building inside. Midwives and women healers knew better. They saw the cycle not as poison, but as pattern. But their voices were often silenced, branded as witches, accused of sorcery if they eased pain too well, or if they helped regulate a cycle with herbs passed down from mother to daughter. Their knowledge was folded into fear, buried beneath male authority. Menstruation also became political. In some courts, the inability to menstruate was grounds for annulment. In others, the presence of menstrual blood was used in accusations of witchcraft. A stain could be proof. A cloth could be evidence. Inquisition records show women interrogated about the timing and nature of their cycles, as though their wombs held secrets darker than their words ever could. Even childbirth was tangled in the same beliefs. They thought that menstrual blood was the source of life, and that a child was formed from it, shaped by the father's seed. But if the blood was corrupted, so too would the child be. A malformed limb, a strange behavior, a curse. And so the health of the womb became a moral concern, not just a medical one. And yet it continued, quietly, relentlessly, every month, across every culture, behind veils, behind walls, behind silence. Women carried it, endured it, hid it, explained it to their daughters in whispers, kept cloths under beds, herbs in pouches, secrets in their bones, because to speak of it was dangerous. To explain it was risky. To be seen as bleeding was to be seen as failing. There were no names for it, not the way we name things now. No clinical words, no diagnoses, no language to distinguish sorrow from delusion, terror from silence. It was all one thing, madness, and madness had to be contained. The first response was usually fear. A child who laughed too much, a woman who stared too long, a man who screamed in the night. All of them were seen as vessels of something broken, or worse, something possessed. Their minds were no longer their own, their bodies unpredictable, and so the world around them moved quickly to bind, to hush, to trap. They built spaces for it, not hospitals, not yet, but cells, rooms with no windows, sheds behind churches, hollow places in monasteries where the disturbed could be hidden. Some were tied to chairs, others to iron rings bolted into the floor. These were not places of healing. They were spaces of survival, for those inside, and for those outside trying to forget what the mind could become. Treatments were improvisations of fear and faith. In many places, madness was seen as spiritual trespass. Demons, curses, ancestral sins. Exorcisms became common. Priests and monks chanted over the afflicted, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. If the patient resisted, they were restrained. If they screamed, it was proof of the demon. If they grew silent, it was a sign of submission or the spirit's retreat. But when prayers failed, the tools came out. Fire, smoke, chains, ice. One method involved placing the patient in a smoke-filled room, believing that the evil inside would be forced to leave through the mouth or ears. Herbs were burned, sometimes calming, sometimes toxic. The smoke stung the eyes, coated the throat. Some passed out. Others fought. Either way, it was seen as progress. Water was another weapon. Cold baths, sudden plunges into freezing rivers, or the infamous dousing buckets. Huge containers of water thrown at the restraint, over and over, to shock the madness loose. Some were submerged until near unconsciousness, then revived and questioned. Did the voices stop? Did the visions change? Did they remember who they were? Electricity hadn't been discovered yet, but the idea was the same. Disrupt the mind. Pain was a signal. Movement was control. Stillness was success. In wealthier cities, madness became a spectacle. Asylums opened not just for treatment, but for display. In London's infamous Bedlam Hospital, the public could pay to walk through the halls and stare at the patients behind iron bars. They jeered. They laughed. They tossed coins or scraps of food. The mad were reduced to exhibits. Evidence of what happens when the mind disobeys the world. Some were shackled for decades. Chains wrapped around ankles, bolted into walls. Arms bound across chests. Mouths gagged, not to prevent violence, but to enforce silence. If you did not speak, you were easier to ignore, easier to call gone. But not all believed the mind was lost. Some healers still followed ancient ideas. They believed that madness came from too much heat in the brain or bad vapors rising from the stomach. So they bled the mad, cut their arms, their necks, their thighs, let the imbalance leak away. Others applied poultices on the forehead, the spine, the soles of the feet, mixtures of vinegar, herbs, crushed insects, anything that might reset the soul's course. Restraint beds were invented to keep the body still during these cures. Leather straps across the chest, iron helmets to hold the head in place. If the patient screamed, the straps were tightened. If they begged, the mouth was stuffed with cloth. If they stopped moving altogether, it was called peace. Even music was weaponized. They played drums, flutes, bells. Some believed music could drive out evil. Others thought it lulled the agitated. A man might be kept in a room with a single song played endlessly, to wear down his madness. A woman might be forced to chant until her voice cracked. If she kept singing, they said she was still possessed. If she stopped, they said she was cured. And always there was isolation. Days without light. Rooms without windows. Food slid through slits in the wall. The mind, already fragile, began to dissolve. Some screamed for weeks. Others whispered to corners. And eventually, some fell into silence. Empty, blinking, drifting. The treatments had worked. They said the madness had been drained. But what remained was no longer a person. Only the shell. Some families kept their mad at home, locked in cellars, hidden in barns, chained to beds. Not out of cruelty, always, but out of fear. Fear of shame. Fear of what neighbors would say. Fear of what might happen if the madness turned violent. And sometimes those who were cured returned to the world changed. Quiet, timid, afraid of noise, afraid of touch. They called them survivors. They called them healed. But the fear never left, because the mind, once broken, could never be trusted again. And the world around them, the one that used chains and smoke and silence, still didn't understand what they were trying to fix. The heart was sacred, not just a muscle, not just an organ, but the throne of the soul. To speak of it was reverent, to touch it unthinkable. For centuries, even the most curious physicians circled around the heart without daring to understand it. They feared that what lay beneath the ribs was not only delicate, but divine. Ancient medical texts placed the heart at the center of thought and feeling, not the brain. The brain was cold, quiet, barely alive. The heart, by contrast, was warm, active, always moving. The flutter in the chest after a kiss, the ache during grief, the quickening when afraid. These sensations prove in their eyes that the heart was where the person lived. And so, when illness struck the chest, when the pulse trembled, or the breath grew short, doctors approached with caution. They listened, they measured, but they rarely touched. To cut into the chest was to trespass, to pierce the body's core. The ribs were seen as a cage, not just a bone, but protection, designed by nature to guard the seat of the spirit. Opening them would release something that could never be reclaimed. And so, they worked around it. They bled patients from the arms to reduce pressure on the heart. They applied leeches to the legs or neck, believing that drawing blood away would ease the burden on the chest. Hot poultices were laid over the sternum, herbs, oils, animal fat, anything to soothe the fire within, but the heart itself remained untouched. Some thought it was the source of heat in the body, that it boiled the blood before sending it out in waves. Others believed it was the organ that heard God, that its rhythm was not only biological, but spiritual, a beat placed there by divine will. To disturb it was to risk more than death. It was to silence the soul. Dissections were rare, forbidden in many places. When they did occur, the heart was often the last organ examined. Some physicians refused to remove it entirely. Others cut it reverently, with ritual words spoken as the blade touched flesh. They described it not in medical terms, but in poetry. The chambers were hidden rooms. The valves, gates of life. Even when the science began to change, the reverence lingered. In the Middle Ages, the writings of Galen still held sway. He taught that blood originated in the liver, not the heart, that it moved in waves, not in circles, that the heart's role was to heat and mix, not a pump. And because he had never seen a living heart in motion, these ideas endured, passed from manuscript to manuscript like sacred truth. The discovery of circulation, true circulation, came late. William Harvey, in the 17th century, dared to challenge the old belief. He proved, with careful observation, that the heart was a pump, that it pushed blood through vessels in a closed loop, that it did not create blood. It moved it. But even Harvey did not cut the living heart. He watched animals. He touched the still. He imagined the pulse. But he did not open a chest while it beat, because to do so was still considered violation, not just of anatomy, but of mystery. For common people, the heart retained its metaphor. It was where love lived, where courage bloomed, where betrayal left its mark. They spoke of heartsick and heartbroken and faint of heart. These weren't figures of speech. They were diagnoses. A man might fall ill from grief, and doctors would write, "The heart is burdened." A woman might collapse after losing a child, and it was said her heart had emptied. Treatments focused not on the cause, but the symbol. Warm broth, rest, prayer, a clean room. These were the prescriptions for a heart in distress. In battle, the heart was protected above all. Soldiers wore breastplates not just for protection, but because a wound to heart was seen as a wound to honor. To die with a pierced heart was noble. To survive it, unthinkable, because most never did. And in death, the heart held secrets. Saints were sometimes exhumed, their hearts removed and preserved, believed to hold traces of divinity. Kings had their hearts buried separately from their bodies, to mark the places they had loved most in life. Lovers wrote poems about burying hearts together, even if they had lived apart. The heart was more than tissue. It was memory. Even in medicine, the reluctance to touch it persisted. Surgeries on the heart didn't begin in earnest until the 20th century. Before then, it was assumed that any injury to the heart was fatal, that once pierced, it could not be mended. Doctors dared not try. The beating heart was still too sacred, too fast, too hot, too close to whatever it was that made us human. And so they treated it from a distance. They soothed the pulse. They calmed the breath. They watched the chest rise and fall, and hoped that whatever lived inside would keep beating, just a little longer. For centuries, physicians, philosophers, and priests believed that the womb was not only the seat of life, but also the root of most female suffering. They didn't see it as a stable organ. Instead, they imagined it as something wild, restless, disobedient, capable of moving to the body, rising up into the chest, choking the throat, pressing against the brain. This belief that the womb could wander was not just metaphor, but medical theory, known as the wandering womb. It was blamed for fainting spells, paralysis, convulsions, mood swings, and sudden fits of laughter or silence. If a woman acted strangely, became emotional, or even simply withdrew, the womb was said to be the cause. Ancient Greek physicians such as Hippocrates and Galen described the womb almost like a living creature, moving within the female body in search of moisture or warmth. Plato suggested that it longed for conception. and, if denied, would lash out in protest. Medical texts warned that an idle or empty womb could wreak havoc on a woman's entire system, both physically and spiritually. The treatment they prescribed ranged from the absurd to the brutal. Strong-smelling herbs or oils were placed near a woman's nose to repel the womb, while sweet or pleasant smells were applied near the genitals to lure it back down. Doctors burned resins, inserted pessaries soaked in vinegar or garlic, and even recommended marriage and frequent intercourse to keep the womb occupied and under control. It was not just bodily illness they sought to explain, but behavior. Women who grieved too long or spoke too freely or showed signs of independence were described as suffering from hysteria, a term that literally comes from the Greek word for womb, hystera. If a woman was melancholic, the womb was blamed. If she disobeyed, it was her womb acting out. If she resisted motherhood or failed to conform to expectations, her womb was considered diseased. This thinking gave rise to countless treatments meant to pacify the female body. In mild cases, there were herbal remedies and rest. In more extreme instances, women were bled, confined, subjected to fumigations, or even forcibly married. In some periods, hysteria became justification for institutionalization, where women could be confined for life, not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient. The womb became a symbol of suspicion. Religious texts reinforced its dangers, casting menstruation as unclean and childbirth as punishment. Some theologians believe that menstruation was a physical reminder of Eve's sin, a curse passed through generations. Women were banned from sacred spaces during their cycles and were seen as spiritually impure. Miscarriages were sometimes viewed as divine punishment or signs of moral failure. The female body was not just misunderstood, it was distrusted, and the womb, invisible but powerful, became the most feared part of all. As medicine progressed, so too did the methods of control. By the 19th century, so-called cures for hysteria had become increasingly invasive. Electric shock, genital surgery, forced sexual activity, and even removal of the uterus, the hysterectomy, were prescribed not for medical necessity, but for behavioral correction. Doctors described these procedures as civilizing the body, taming the beast within. The woman's voice, pain, and consent were rarely part of the conversation. And when she screamed, they said it was the illness speaking. The womb was blamed for everything, from physical pain to moral weakness, from sorrow to rebellion. It was not simply a reproductive organ. It was treated as a source of corruption, something to be soothed, controlled, or removed entirely. But for all their efforts to name and punish it, they never truly understood it. It was easier to blame than to listen, easier to cut than to believe. And so, generation after generation of women carried the weight of a diagnosis that never fit, punished for an organ that never actually moved. Long before science touched the brain, long before genetics became explanation, left-handedness was feared, not misunderstood, not tolerated, but feared, named as unnatural, dangerous, even wicked. In the old world, to write, eat or bless with the left hand was to invite suspicion and sometimes punishment. The bias ran deep, etched into language, ritual, and belief. In Latin, the word for left was sinistra, from which we get sinister. Meanwhile, dexter, meaning right, gave us dexterity, skill, favor. This wasn't coincidence. It was worldview. Everything good belonged to the right. Everything suspect to the left. Religious imagery reinforced the divide. In Christian doctrine, the righteous were said to sit at the right hand of God, while the damned were cast to the left. In many medieval paintings of the Last Judgment, the saved are grouped on Christ's right, bathed in light. The left side, however, descends into shadow, distortion, and chaos. For those who live by faith and fear, this wasn't symbolic. It was law. Children who reached with their left hand were corrected, slapped, or tied. Left-handedness was seen as a deviation from divine order, a bodily failure, or worse, a spiritual one. Teachers, too, became enforcers. In schools across Europe and later in colonial systems, left-handed students were retrained, forced to write with their right hand, even if it meant pain, tears, or permanent stutter. Some were made to wear splints, leather straps, or knotted sleeves. Desks were built only for right-handers. Scissors, tools, weapons, all shaped to fit the dominant expectation. If a child persisted in their leftness, it was noted in school records as a behavioral problem or even a moral concern. The left hand wasn't just inconvenient, it was deviant. Superstition clung tightly to this fear. Midwives in many cultures were taught to watch the hands of newborns. If the baby favored the left, it might mean the child would become disobedient or, worse, cursed. In folk magic, the left hand was said to be the hand of sorcery. Spells were cast with the left. Oaths of betrayal were sworn with the left. Witches, it was believed, suckled demons from the left side of the body. And when someone was accused of witchcraft, any sign of left-handedness became damning proof. In battle, left-handedness was a liability. Swords and shields were made for right-handed combat. A left-handed soldier disrupted formation, confused comrades, and drew suspicion. Some commanders ordered left-handers to train with their right, regardless of efficiency. In law, left-handed signatures were viewed with doubt, as if the slant of the writing revealed something twisted in the soul. People who used their left hand too comfortably were often distrusted, not for what they did, but for how they did it. Even in everyday gestures, the left hand was reserved for what was impure. In many cultures, it was and still is considered offensive to offer the left hand in greeting, to eat with it, or to hand someone an object. The left hand was associated with cleaning, waste, shadow, and so it became a kind of silent marker. Those who used it too often, too freely, were quietly set apart, sometimes scolded, sometimes shamed, often changed. Medical theories tried to explain it away. In the early modern period, some believed that left-handedness was caused by a weakness in the brain or an imbalance in the womb. Others claimed it was hereditary degeneration, a flaw in the bloodline. A few said it came from trauma in the cradle, a mother's neglect, or early illness. The common thread was clear. Something had gone wrong. Left-handedness wasn't seen as a variation. It was seen as an error. And yet, left-handers continued to appear, quietly, stubbornly. Some hid it. Others were forced to. A rare few refused. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and writers like Lewis Carroll were left-handed, though many were pressured to conceal it. In courts and churches, in workshops and schools, left-handers learned to adapt. They wrote awkwardly. They gripped tools differently. They performed daily acts of translation, not between languages, but between the world's expectation and their own nature. The fear never fully disappeared. Into the 20th century, left-handed children were still punished in classrooms across Europe, America, and parts of Asia. Some were diagnosed with neurological disorders. Others were institutionalized. Parents were advised to train the hand early, as if correcting a posture or a limp. In truth, they were teaching obedience to tradition, to symmetry, to the fear of difference. And all of it traced back to the same ancient belief, that the left hand was not just other, but wrong. Today, much of that fear has faded, but its echoes remain in language, in design, and reflex. The world is still built for the right-handed, still suspicious of asymmetry, still slow to accept what doesn't conform. And somewhere deep in the folds of that suspicion, the old fear still lingers, that to favor the left is to step into shadow, that to reach with the wrong hand is to risk being marked. Pain in the mouth was different. It was constant. Close. It kept you from eating, from speaking, from sleeping. A toothache in the distant past wasn't just discomfort. It was punishment. It was believed to be the body crying out, but no one agreed on what it was crying for. Some said it was a worm, gnawing from the inside. Others believed it was spirits trapped in the gums. And some thought it was a sign of guilt made physical, a small hidden suffering that came from sins unspoken. No matter the cause, the treatment was never gentle. Before dentistry, there were only remedies, and most of them hurt. The first step was to identify which tooth was angry, without x-rays or mirrors or anesthesia. This often meant touching the suspect tooth with metal, with fire, with a knife. If the patient flinched, that was confirmation. Some healers used red-hot irons to burn the poison out of the nerve. Others pushed smoldering herbs into the hole with sticks or bone picks. Pain was seen not as something to avoid, but something to trust. The worse it felt, the more it proved the cure was working. Animal fat played its own strange role. In rural villages, pig fat or goose grease was warmed and packed around the jaw, supposedly to draw out swelling or melt the trapped wind that caused the pain. Some wrapped the head in cloth soaked in lard and vinegar, tying it tight until the patient could no longer speak. Others mixed the fat with crushed garlic or ashes or even human milk, smearing it directly into mouth while prayers were whispered for relief. In some traditions, the toothache was seen as a kind of haunting. A soul of the dead, they believed, could enter the body through food or drink and settle into the jaw. In such cases, the healer would perform a small exorcism, burning bones or teeth of animals, using the smoke to drive the spirit out. Bells were rung. Psalms were sung. The patient was told not to eat for 3 days, and if the pain returned, it meant the ghost was still angry. For those with no access to such rituals, the solutions were cruder. Tooth removal was brutal. There were no trained hands, only strength and speed. The tooth puller would arrive with tongs or pliers, or whatever could grip. They worked in markets, on street corners, sometimes in alehouses, where few drinks were all the anesthesia a poor man could afford. There were no gloves, no antiseptic, only a quick yank, a burst of blood, and often a scream that echoed down the alleyways. But even after the tooth was gone, the suffering rarely stopped. Infection spread, abscesses formed, jaws swelled shut. People died of toothaches. Quietly, slowly, often in bed, clutching their faces while family watched, unable to help. And through it all, remedies continued. Heated stones placed under pillows, crushed nettle leaves packed into the cheek, whispers to saints who were said to answer prayers of the suffering. Saint Apollonia, in particular, became a name passed from mouth to mouth. They said she had all her teeth pulled during martyrdom, and so she understood the pain. Her name was carved into walls, sewn into handkerchiefs, mumbled through broken jaws. There were stories, too, of people biting iron to scare the pain out, or placing coins under the tongue to fool the spirits into leaving. Some children were told to spit their first loose tooth into the fire, lest a toothache grow in its place. Old teeth were sometimes buried. Others were thrown into running water, as if the stream could carry the pain away. These weren't superstitions. These were survival. And while some methods seemed kinder, cloves placed near the gum, honey boiled with thyme, the truth was that almost nothing worked. Not really. Not for long. People lived with mouth pain for months, even years. They learned to chew on one side, to speak with clenched teeth, to sleep sitting up when lying flat brought unbearable pressure. They prayed not for healing, but for numbness. And eventually, when the pain left, it wasn't always because of a cure. Sometimes the nerve simply died, or the tooth fell out, or the person did. Today, a visit to the dentist is quick, precise, clinical. But long ago, the sound of someone moaning through the night with swollen gums was familiar. It meant someone was being punished, by the body, or by something deeper. And outside the window, someone else was already boiling fat over the fire, preparing the only medicine they knew. There are graves that hold more than bones. Quiet earth that hides not only the dead, but the fears of the living. In some places, when a body was lowered into the ground, something extra was added. A brick, a stone, a heavy shard of pottery, placed firmly into the mouth of the deceased. Not by accident, not as tradition, but as a precaution, to stop something from coming back. The practice appears in burial sites across Europe, particularly in places touched by plague, famine, or unexplainable death. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of skeletons with jaws pried open, sometimes forcefully, their mouths filled with rough blocks, as if silencing something. The people who did this didn't leave notes. They didn't explain. But their message was clear. Something had gone wrong, and they couldn't risk it happening again. In the minds of those who lived through disease and war, death wasn't always the end. Some corpses were believed to linger, spiritually, physically, or both. The word revenant was used to describe the dead who returned not as ghosts but as bodies, moving, breathing, corrupted. These weren't the pale, poetic vampires of later fiction. They were bloated, loud, rotted, hungry, and worst of all, contagious. In some parts of Eastern Europe, the fear of the undead took precise forms. Villagers told stories of corpses shifting in their graves, chewing through their shrouds, groaning in the night. They believed that plague spread not only through touch, but through speech, the corpse whispering its illness into the world, one victim at a time. And so they answered with silence, with bricks. The idea was both symbolic and surgical. By placing a stone in the mouth, they closed a passage through which disease or evil might escape. It was a seal, a muzzle, a final command. Stay silent, stay still, and if the mouth could not be sealed gently, it was broken open. Some skulls showed cracked jaws, shattered teeth. The fear was greater than the reverence. The body had to be stopped. Not every brick was the same. Some were smooth river stones, rounded by time. Others were jagged, broken straight from a wall. A few graves included iron implements, nails, sickles, blades, laid across the throat or chest, in case the mouth was enough. And while the methods varied, the intention remained. Do not let this one rise. The people chosen for this treatment weren't always criminals. Sometimes they were strangers, or the first to die in a plague wave, or those whose deaths were considered suspicious. Too sudden, too loud, too far from holy ground. Women accused of witchcraft, children born out of wedlock, travelers who spoke unfamiliar tongues. In uncertain times, any difference could become danger. And once a person was feared, their corpse became a threat. There are records, too, of devourers, a strange category of the dead believed to feed on the energy of the living from beneath the soil. These corpses didn't rise. They didn't walk, but they consumed, through chewing, biting, grinding their teeth in the grave. And the only way to stop them was to fill their mouths with dirt, ash, or stone, to choke the hunger where it began. Even the church, which publicly condemned such superstitions, quietly allowed them to continue. Priests turned blind eyes to strange burials. Monks recorded local rituals in the margins of their manuscripts. How to pin a corpse with thorns, how to burn the heart of the disobedient dead, how to detect when the grave was not truly still. These notes weren't doctrine, but they were warnings. And so, the graves remained guarded. Families returned to burial sites weeks after the funeral, checking for signs. Soil that had shifted, flowers that withered too fast, animals refusing to go near. If they suspected unrest, they dug. And if they found a corpse they believed to be the source, bloated, discolored, its mouth agape, they corrected the mistake. They opened the jaw. They placed a brick. They buried again. Today, those graves are studied, measured, interpreted. Scientists call them deviant burials. Historians debate their meaning. But the people who placed those bricks didn't need theory. They had fear. They had loss. They had stories told by candlelight about what happens when the dead don't rest. And so they did what they could, not to hurt the dead, but to protect the living, with earth, with silence, with stone in the mouth of the unknown. For centuries, illness was seen not as an invasion, but an imbalance. The body was thought to contain four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and when they were in harmony, health followed. But if one overflowed even slightly, the result could be fevers, tremors, melancholy, madness, or worse. And of all the humors, blood was the one most often accused of misbehaving. Too much blood meant heat, agitation, disorder. And so, the answer was simple: let out. Bleeding became the most common medical procedure in Europe for well over 1,000 years. From the humblest village healer to the most respected university-trained physician, bloodletting was prescribed for almost everything. Headaches, swollen joints, fevers, forgetfulness, gout, nosebleeds, fainting, childbirth complications, even nightmares. If you were ill, your veins were opened. It didn't matter what you were suffering from. The logic was universal. Sickness was stuck inside you, and bleeding would release it. The practice was ritualistic. A patient was seated, sometimes tied, and a vein was chosen, usually the forearm, sometimes the neck, occasionally the ankle. The physician would warm the limb, tie it off with a leather strap, and then slice the vein with a lancet or sharpened quill. The blood flowed into a bowl, measured not in teaspoons, but in pints. Some doctors believed that the illness would weaken as the color of the blood changed, darkening toward health. Others timed the bleeding by pulse or by prayer. Leeches were used too, not as a kinder alternative, but as a supplement. These small worms were placed on the skin and allowed to attach, drinking until they dropped off, swollen and red. They were especially popular for children and women, whose bodies were considered too delicate for knives. Some patients endured dozens of leeches at once, their skin dotted with tiny holes. Their blood drained slowly over hours. The treatment was praised for being natural, precise, and spiritually neutral. There were even charts, manuscripts that illustrated which veins are open for which illness, and when. Tuesday was good for liver problems, Friday for melancholy. Some veins were bled only during certain moon phases. Others were linked to astrological signs. Medicine and mysticism were deeply entwined, and a question one was to challenge both. Barbers, too, became surgeons of the blood. Their red and white striped poles, still seen today, symbolize their dual trade: red for blood, white for the bandages. In towns without physicians, it was the barber who cut hair, pulled teeth, and sliced veins. The tools were the same: sharp, fast, often reused. Sanitation was not yet understood, and so many patients left the bleeding table not cured, but infected. Still they returned, because the pain of illness was visible. The pain of infection, not yet named. For women, bleeding became a form of control. If a woman wept too often or raged or refused to obey, she was said to have too much blood in the brain. If she desired too much or not enough, the uterus was blamed. But the cure was still bleeding. Doctors bled women to quiet them, to cool their wounds, to ease hysteria. Menstruation, they believed, was the body's natural form of bloodletting, and when it ceased or changed, artificial bleeding was prescribed to restore balance. There were times when the patient was so weak they could barely sit, and still they were bled. A feverish child, pale and shaking, might be held down while the lancet worked. An old man coughing blood might be told his lungs were too hot. The idea that blood itself was sacred, essential, or finite had no place in the doctrine of humors. It was not the volume of blood that mattered. It was its harmony. When the plague swept through cities and towns, bleeding was used in desperation. The black boils were cut open, the blood beneath drained. And when people died anyway, the blame fell on fate, not on the knife. Even into the Enlightenment, when science began to question ancient texts, bleeding remained common. It was familiar. It was visible. It felt like action in a time of helplessness. Some doctors, like William Harvey, who discovered the circulation of blood, began to challenge the method. But even he did not abandon it entirely. The idea that illness could be solved by subtraction had rooted itself so deeply into medical thought that it persisted well into the 19th century. George Washington, first president of the United States, was bled on his deathbed. Nearly 2.5 liters removed in the final hours of his life. Some say it killed him. Others say it simply failed to help. Eventually, the theory of humors faded, but the scars of bleeding remained. In paintings, in poems, in old medical journals, you find references to it still. Lines about bad blood, about letting out the illness, about balance restored through emptiness. The bowls are now dry. The leeches contained in museums. But for a long, long time, the knife was trusted more than the symptom. And in the silence of old clinics and quiet houses, the sound of blood dripping into brass bowls was once as common as breath itself. For much of human history, the dream was not seen as a product of the mind, but as a visitor, something from the outside, something that entered silently through the night and made its home behind the eyes. When dreams were gentle, they were blessings, messages from the divine, whispers from the dead, glimpses of futures not yet born. But when dreams were cruel, when they left you trembling, breathless, or unable to sleep again, they were feared. They were omens, punishments, and they needed explanation. People feared bad dreams because they believed they could leave a mark. A nightmare wasn't just something you shook off in the morning. It could damage the body, poison the spirit, or invite something dark into soul. Across cultures and centuries, bad dreams were blamed on many things. Food, spirits, sins, even posture. Physicians in ancient Greece warned against eating too late at night. Rich meats, wine, onions. These were said to rot in the stomach and send fumes rising into the brain. The body digested in darkness. And if the stomach worked too hard, it heated the blood. That heat, they believed, stirred the mind into unnatural images. Dreams were seen as a fever behind the eyes. Other healers said dreams came from the liver. If the humors were imbalanced, too much yellow bile, for example, then the dreams would be violent, fast, and burning. Black bile brought sadness, grief, slow-moving images filled with loss. Dreams were reflections of the body's internal state, not signals in the brain, but symptoms of something deeper. Religious leaders, too, had their explanations. A bad dream could be a warning from God, or it could be the work of the devil. If a person dreamed of death or blood or falling into fire, it was often seen as punishment for secret sins. In the Middle Ages, priests warned that demons could enter the body during sleep. They could press upon the chest, whisper into the soul, or twist thoughts until the dreamer awoke in terror. These weren't metaphors. They were spiritual dangers. The nightmare was real, and sometimes it didn't end upon waking. The figure of the nightmare, as both idea and entity, was deeply feared. The word itself comes from mare, an Old English term for a malevolent spirit that sat on the chest of sleepers, stealing breath and planting fear. People described the feeling as being paralyzed, as if something heavy pressed down on them while they tried to scream, but couldn't. Today, we might call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was an attack. The remedy wasn't medical. It was ritual. Charms were hung near the bed. Prayers were recited before sleep. In some homes, iron nails were driven into the headboard to keep spirits away. Others placed knives under pillows or salt around the bed. These were not symbols. They were protection. Children were especially vulnerable. Parents told them not to sleep on their backs, lest they invite spirits to sit on them. Nightmares in children were often blamed on curses or bad air or inherited guilt. If a child woke screaming, the house was searched for objects out of place. A bird in the window, a shoe turned upside down. These could all be signs that the dream had come from somewhere, someone. There were even books, manuals, that claimed to interpret dreams. If you saw a teeth falling out, it meant a death in the family. If you dreamed of water, it meant emotion, danger, or change. If you flew, it was not freedom, it was temptation. And if you fell, it meant punishment was near. People read these texts not for entertainment, but for guidance. The dream was a warning, and it was foolish to ignore it. For women, nightmares were often pathologized. A woman who dreamed too much was seen as unstable. If she cried upon waking, or refused to describe what she saw, she might be diagnosed with hysteria. The womb, once again, was blamed for pulling dreams upward into the brain. Some doctors prescribed bleeding. Others suggested marriage. A few recommended complete silence. No reading, no storytelling, no talking after sunset. Dreaming, like so much else in a woman's life, was treated as a danger to be controlled. Over time, the explanations changed, but the fear remained. Even when Freud arrived centuries later, describing dreams as wishes and memories, not demons, he did not remove the dread. He simply named it differently. Dreams still meant something. They still exposed things we didn't understand. The old fears, the food, the spirits, the night air, never truly vanished. They became background noise in a world that still doesn't fully know why we dream or why some dreams hurt. And so, for thousands of years, people went to sleep cautiously, with prayers, with herbs, with charms, not to summon dreams, but to keep them away, because they knew that once the body went still, the mind would open, and not everything that entered would be kind. In a time when illness was everywhere and answers were few, people turned to what was available: herbs, minerals, prayers, but also bodies, not living ones. Not always. For centuries across Europe and parts of the Middle East, the dead were not only buried or mourned, they were used, consumed, preserved in oils and powders, ground into tinctures and salves. Medicine, they believed, could come from death, and so it did. This wasn't seen as grotesque. It was seen as practical, even noble. If someone had died and their body could be used to save the living, was that not an act of mercy? a form of sacrifice. The lines between corpse and cure blurred quietly, without drama. And so human remains, bones, blood, fat, even mummified flesh, became part of the apothecary's shelf, stored next to cinnamon, measured beside mercury. One of the most prized substances was mumia, not the mythical monster, but powdered mummy, ground from preserved Egyptian corpses looted from ancient tombs. Traders sold it in jars, claiming to cure everything from headaches to bleeding lungs. Physicians recommended it for internal bleeding, epilepsy, bruises, and poison. They believed that because mummies had resisted decay, they contained life-preserving energy. Death, preserved perfectly, became medicine. But when supplies ran low or demand grew too high, grave robbers and opportunists created fakes. New corpses were dried with tar, wrapped in cloth, and passed off as ancient. Some were stolen from hospitals, others from gallows. The bodies of the executed were considered especially potent, full of vital force violently interrupted. Their fat was melted down into poor man's balm, a treatment for gout, broken bones, and skin disease. Blood was sometimes collected straight from the scaffold, still warm. People paid for it, drank it, prayed it would give them strength. Skulls were ground into fine powder, believed to calm seizures. Human bones were steeped in wine to treat ailments of the spine. In one recipe, a moss that grew on skulls buried in churchyards was scraped off, dried, and boiled into tea. It was called usnea and prescribed for nosebleeds and infections. The idea was simple. The body, in its return to the earth, gained properties that the living could borrow. Death, if handled correctly, became healing. Even royalty took part. King Charles II of England was known to carry a special concoction called King's Drops, made with gold and powdered human skull. He drank it regularly. Wealth did not protect one from belief or desperation. Doctors across social classes prescribed similar treatments. Human fat was rubbed into joints. Teeth of the dead were implanted into the mouths of the wealthy. In some cases, entire limbs were dissected in the search for disease-fighting tissue. It was not taboo. It was science in its earliest, hungriest form. Religious concerns were sometimes raised, but just as often dismissed. The argument was that God had made the body, and if the body could heal itself, why couldn't it also heal others? Monks preserved bones of saints as relics, believed to cure through touch. So why not use the common dead for medicine? The idea spread quietly, written in Latin, passed in whispers, shared between those too poor to refuse help and too sick to ask questions. There was no anesthesia, no regulation. The body was cut, scraped, boiled, dried, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with greed, always with the belief that suffering justified the means. If someone had died young, their remains were seen as especially powerful. Virgins, children, unblemished flesh. The purer the life, the stronger the medicine. No one asked for permission. The dead did not speak. Eventually, medical understanding changed. New theories arrived. Germs replaced ghosts. Laboratories replaced markets. The idea of corpse medicine began to fade, dismissed as superstition or barbarism. But traces of it lingered. In some rural areas, the practice continued into the 19th century, in whispered prayers, in hidden shelves, in the quiet trade of desperate people. And so for hundreds of years, when no herb would work and no prayer was answered, the last hope was the body, not the one that suffered, but the one that had already gone still. Flesh returned to flesh, blood swallowed, bone reduced to dust and stirred into wine, a cure taken from silence. When the plague came, it came without warning. First a cough, then a swelling, then the shaking, the darkening of the skin, the smell. Whole neighborhoods fell silent within days. In some cities, carts creaked through the streets at dawn, collecting bodies that had only recently been laughing, eating, praying. The world knew sickness before, but this was different. It felt like judgment, like something crawling beneath the surface of God's patience. And people needed someone or something to blame. They looked down and they saw the rats. Small, quick, always watching. They were everywhere, in cellars, in kitchens, in the shadows between cobblestones. Some carried fleas. Some did not. But their presence during a time of horror made them more than pests. They became symbols of decay, of disease, of death made visible. And so, for centuries, the rat has carried the guilt of plague on its thin, twitching back. The Black Death, as it would later be called, arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century and killed an estimated one-third of the population. Its arrival was swift, its symptoms gruesome, and its causes unknown. At the time, people blamed the stars, the sins of others, the wrath of God, or foul air rising from the earth. But as death settled into every corner of every city, the connection between rats and disease became too visible to ignore. They were everywhere the plague was. That seemed like enough. Later, science would suggest that fleas living on rats were the true carriers, specifically the fleas Xenophilicopies, which could transmit Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. As rats died, the fleas jumped to humans, spreading the disease without mercy. This became the accepted truth for centuries. The rat was no longer just a symbol. It was the accused, convicted, and condemned. But the story is more complicated. In recent years, historians and epidemiologists have revisited the evidence. They've noticed something strange. The plague sometimes spread too quickly, jumping across cities and countries faster than rat and flea populations could explain. Some outbreaks moved at the pace of human travel, not rodent migration. Others emerged in areas with very few rats at all. This has led to theories that humans themselves, through their own parasites like lice, may have played a larger role than once thought. And yet, the image of the rat remains. It's easier to blame something separate from ourselves. Something dirty, something low to the ground, something we can trap, poison, and throw away. Blaming rats allowed people to avoid a darker truth. That disease lives among us. That it travels not just in vermin, but in breath, in touch, in trade, in the movements of people seeking safety and carrying danger with them. In some cities, rat killers became public servants, paid to hunt the creatures down, rewarded by the tail. They searched alleys and granaries with dogs and sticks, leaving small mountains of corpses in their wake. But the plague still came. It arrived in the morning market and the evening prayer. It ignored the absence of rats. It made itself at home in human lungs and lingered in silence. There were rituals, of course, fires to cleanse the air, bells rung backwards to confuse the devil, herbs burned on windowsills, doors marked with paint to warn others, sickness within, and always eyes searching for rats, as if removing the creature would remove the fear. Even today, the word plague conjures an image of rats, in movies, in textbooks, in memory. But the truth is heavier, more ambiguous. Yes, rats played a part, but so did we, in our cities built too close, in our fear of fresh air, in our misunderstanding of what illness truly was. We carried the plague in ignorance, in denial, in movement. The rat remains the scapegoat, a convenient symbol for the chaos we could not contain. But it was never just about the rat. The plague came because it could, because the world was ready for it, even if it didn't know. And when it left, it didn't vanish. It lingered in stories, in bones, in habits that still shape the way we fear sickness today. For as long as people have died, they have wondered what happens next. The body stills, the breath leaves, but does something remain? Across continents and centuries, the question echoed softly in temples, in graveyards, in the silence that follows mourning. The answers were many, but they were never casual. The soul they believed did not vanish. It went somewhere, and sometimes it lingered. In ancient Egypt, the soul was not one thing but several. The Ka, the life force, stayed near the body and needed food and offerings. The Ba, a bird-like spirit, traveled between worlds. And the Ak, the most luminous part, could become eternal if the right spells were spoken, if the body was preserved, if the rituals were performed perfectly. The dead needed help to cross into the afterlife. That meant care. That meant memory. That meant being buried whole with words and silence. The Greeks imagined something quieter, a shadowy journey to the underworld, where souls wandered the banks of the river Styx, waiting for the ferryman Charon The poor might be trapped without a coin for passage. The forgotten might drift without end. The blessed rested in the Elysian fields. The damned suffered in Tartarus. But most souls, they believed, simply faded. They became echoes, not punished, not praised, just silent. In medieval Europe, the Christian soul faced judgment, swift and severe. Heaven or hell, or perhaps a waiting room in between. Purgatory, a place of fire, not for the wicked, but for the unfinished. The soul had to be purified before it could see the face of God. This meant prayers, masses paid for by the living, offerings left by children and spouses. Every prayer shortened the pain. Every candle lit a step closer to light. And if no one prayed, the soul lingered longer, forgotten in smoke. Elsewhere, beliefs varied. In some cultures, the soul was reborn, returned in a new body, shaped by the deeds of the previous life. A good life meant a better chance next time. A cruel life might return as suffering. Karma, they called it, a ledger written in invisible ink. Death was not an end, but a cycle. One life into the next, over and over, until the soul was light enough to rise, or wise enough to vanish. For the Norse, the soul could go to Valhalla, a warrior's heaven, but only if death came with a sword in hand. Others might go to hell, a colder, quieter place, not evil, just elsewhere. The dead needed songs to guide them, weapons to carry, names to be remembered. A man forgotten, they said, truly died twice. In many places, the soul didn't travel far. It stayed near home, rested under floorboards, sat in corners, listened to conversations long after its body was buried. The grieving left food, whispered apologies, or kept rooms undisturbed, just in case. Dreams were doorways. A visit from the dead was both feared and welcomed. If a soul returned angry, it meant something had been left undone. A debt, a betrayal, a lie. And so the living took care, not out of fear of ghosts, but out of duty. Tombs were cleaned, names spoken, candles lit on anniversaries. The soul was not a superstition. It was a presence, an invisible guest at every table, every birth, every death. Children were told to behave because ancestors were watching, not judging, just watching. Over time, beliefs blurred. Science grew louder. The soul became a metaphor, then a debate, but it never disappeared. Even now, in the quietest moments, people look up or pause or whisper to no one. They light candles in churches, place stones on graves, or carry photos in wallets long after the funeral. The gestures may have changed. The questions have not. What happens when the breath leaves? Does the soul rise? Does it wait? Does it dissolve into memory, into stories, into the corners of familiar rooms? No one knows. But for most of history, people didn't need certainty. They needed rituals. They needed ways to speak to the silence. And so they buried their dead with food, with coins, with prayers. They told stories around fires. They believed the soul was real, not because they could prove it, but because without it, the world felt too empty.